What you are about to realize in the next 15 seconds is that the reason rejection hurts so intensely, so instantly, and so deeply has nothing to do with the person who didn't choose you, and everything to do with the ancient, brutal wiring inside your brain that treats emotional rejection the same way it treats physical danger. Because the very moment someone pulls away, ignores you, abandons you, or even hesitates long enough for your mind to interpret it as disinterest, your brain reacts with the same biological alarm system it developed thousands of years ago when being excluded from the tribe meant death. And the most terrifying part is that no matter how smart you are, how strong you pretend to be, or how well you try to hide it, your brain cannot tell the difference between a stranger ignoring your message and a predator threatening your survival, which means you are biologically designed to suffer the moment you feel unwanted. What most people never understand is that rejection is not a psychological event, it is a neurological emergency. Because when someone pulls away from you, your brain activates a cluster of regions that overlap with those responsible for physical pain, triggering the anterior cingulate cortex, the amygdala, and the prefrontal systems all at once. And this sudden activation sends waves of stress chemicals through your bloodstream, tightening your chest, clouding your thinking, and making you feel like you're losing control, even though nothing physically is happening to you. But because the brain has evolved to equate rejection with danger, it reacts as if your entire world is under threat, leaving you confused about why something as simple as a text message, a pause, a cold tone, or an unexpected silence can feel like psychological violence. What nobody teaches you is that rejection doesn't damage who you are. It damages how your brain functions in the moment, because the instant you sense disapproval or abandonment, your brain releases cortisol and adrenaline while lowering your serotonin and dopamine levels, creating a chemical imbalance that makes you overthink, panic, catastrophize, and imagine the worst possible outcomes. Not because you're dramatic or emotional, but because your brain is scrambling to regain a sense of control over a situation that makes you feel powerless. And the most unsettling part is that these reactions happen before you consciously register the rejection, meaning the pain hits you before the story forms in your mind, making you feel overwhelmed without knowing why you feel overwhelmed. And that confusion amplifies the suffering even more. What makes rejection psychologically devastating is not the event itself, but the meaning your brain automatically attaches to it. Because instead of interpreting rejection as a simple mismatch or a normal part of human interaction, your mind jumps to ancient survival scripts and begins to whisper dangerous lies like, "You're not enough," "You're unworthy," or "You're losing something essential." And even though these statements are not rational, your nervous system treats them as absolute truth, because emotional pain cannot be separated from the survival instincts wired into your biology. And this is why a single moment of rejection can awaken every insecurity you've ever suppressed, making you feel like everything is collapsing, even though nothing visible has changed. What people rarely admit is that rejection creates a kind of psychological tunnel vision, because when someone withdraws their affection, respect, attention, or approval, your brain immediately starts scanning for explanations, replaying conversations, analyzing every detail, imagining alternative outcomes, and obsessively searching for clues to justify the emotional wound. And this compulsive looping is not weakness, but a survival mechanism designed to prevent future rejection by forcing you to learn from painful experiences. But in the modern world, this survival mechanism becomes a psychological trap, because your brain keeps analyzing emotional situations as if they were physical threats, creating cycles of rumination that drain your energy, distort your perspective, and make you feel trapped inside your own mind long after the moment of rejection has passed. What you must understand is that your brain's reaction to rejection is not random. It is engineered by millions of years of evolution, because in prehistoric times, belonging to a group was essential for survival. As humans depended on tribes for food, safety, reproduction, and protection, and to ensure no one drifted too far from the group, the brain evolved to make social exclusion unbearably painful, turning emotional rejection into a biological warning system that demands immediate attention. And even though we now live in modern society with independence, technology, and individualism, the brain has not updated this system. So when someone rejects you today, you experience ancient survival fear in a modern environment, which is why emotional pain feels disproportionately intense compared to the situation that triggered it. What makes rejection uniquely destructive is that it activates both the emotional and cognitive parts of your brain simultaneously. Because while your emotional brain screams that you are in danger, your rational brain tries to understand what happened. And this internal conflict creates mental dissonance that leaves you feeling unbalanced, insecure, and desperate for clarity. And in your attempt to regain emotional stability, you become more attached to the person who hurt you, more fixated on the situation, and more reactive to every little sign or signal. Not because you want them back, but because your brain is searching for relief from the panic that rejection ignites, making you chase closure, reassurance, or explanation, even when it doesn't serve you. What is even more shocking is that rejection does not simply hurt you emotionally. It rewires your brain moment by moment, because each time you experience rejection, your neural circuits for self-worth, trust, and emotional regulation are impacted, causing your mind to become more sensitive to future rejection, more vigilant, more reactive, and more dependent on external validation for emotional stability. And this means that every unreturned call, every ignored message, every cold response, every distancing tone, and every withheld approval slowly trains your brain to fear relationships, question yourself, and seek safety through control, avoidance, or people-pleasing, creating patterns that follow you into adulthood, without you realizing they began as neurobiological responses to early emotional wounds. What no one ever tells you is that your brain is not trying to hurt you when it reacts this way. It is trying to protect you, but its protection mechanisms are outdated, overly sensitive, and catastrophically misaligned with the world you live in. Because while rejection no longer threatens your literal survival, your brain still acts as if it does, and until you recognize that your emotional pain is coming from ancient wiring, instead of present danger, you will continue to feel destroyed by experiences that were never supposed to define you. And understanding this difference is the first step toward breaking the psychological cycle that rejection traps you in, allowing you to separate the pain you feel from the meaning you attach to it. What you need to understand now is that the brain's reaction to rejection does not end in the moment you feel hurt, because while the emotional sting fades, the neurological aftermath continues to ripple through your mind like an invisible shockwave, influencing your thoughts, decisions, behaviors, and relationships long after the event is over. And the most disturbing part is that these aftershocks often feel like your own thoughts, rather than the residue of a biological survival response, which makes it almost impossible to distinguish between what is real and what is simply the brain trying to cope with a perceived threat. What most people don't realize is that once the brain registers rejection, it automatically shifts into a hypervigilant state, scanning for danger even where danger doesn't exist, meaning a single painful experience can make you interpret neutral situations as hostile, normal interactions as suspicious, and ordinary human behavior as personal attacks, not because you're paranoid or dramatic, but because the amygdala, the fear center of your brain, remains activated for hours, or even days after rejection. And this heightened sensitivity makes you read too deeply into tone, hesitations, silence, and body language, turning you into a psychological detective even though the mystery you're trying to solve exists only inside your mind. What makes this so destructive is that the brain begins to generate predictions based on past pain, automatically expecting rejection even when there is no evidence for it. And this expectation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when you assume someone is losing interest, pulling away, or preparing to hurt you, your behavior subtly changes. You become guarded, distant, overly attentive, or emotionally reactive. And these changes in your energy alter how others respond to you, creating tension, confusion, or discomfort that did not exist before, but now becomes the very rejection you feared, which the brain then uses as proof that its prediction was correct, reinforcing the cycle over and over again. What people fail to see is that rejection damages not only how you see others, but how you see yourself. Because when your brain experiences emotional pain, your self-worth circuits take the hit, weakening your internal sense of stability and making you depend more on external validation to feel okay. And when you don't receive that validation, or when it comes inconsistently, you feel destabilized, insecure, and trapped in an emotional tug-of-war between wanting closeness and fearing it. And this internal conflict often drives you to chase people who hurt you and push away people who genuinely care. Not because you are confused, but because your brain is trying to protect itself from further injury by controlling the intensity and direction of emotional attachment. What makes rejection particularly dangerous is that it can distort your memory, rewriting details in a way that keeps you stuck in the past. Because when the brain is under emotional stress, the hippocampus, responsible for memory, begins to record events through the lens of threat, meaning you remember moments more painfully than they were, exaggerate the importance of negative interactions, and minimize or forget positive experiences, creating a biased emotional narrative that convinces you that rejection wasn't just a moment, but a pattern, even if that pattern exists only in your mind. And this distorted memory becomes the emotional blueprint you subconsciously use to navigate future relationships and decisions. What no one tells you is that rejection creates emotional residue that can attach itself to completely unrelated areas of your life, turning small setbacks into overwhelming emotional triggers. Because when your brain is already operating from a wounded state, even minor inconveniences, like a delayed message, a disagreement, a correction at work, or a perceived loss, can reignite the same neural pathways that were activated during past rejection, causing you to feel disproportionately hurt or threatened. And this emotional flooding makes you feel out of control, even though the problem isn't the situation, but the unresolved neurological imprint left behind by earlier wounds. What is even more unsettling is that the brain begins to avoid emotional risk the same way it avoids physical danger, training you to shrink your desires, lower your expectations, and suppress your voice to avoid the possibility of being rejected again. And over time, this avoidance quietly erodes your confidence, your ambition, your authenticity, and your emotional resilience, leaving you in a state where you crave connection but fear exposure, want intimacy but avoid vulnerability, and desire love, but reject yourself before anyone else can, creating a psychological paradox that keeps you emotionally paralyzed without understanding why. What amplifies the pain of rejection is the way it disrupts your sense of identity, because when someone rejects you, especially someone you respected, loved, admired, or depended on, the brain instinctively rewrites your self-image based on their disapproval, as if the rejection becomes a mirror reflecting back a distorted version of who you are. And because the mind is wired to prioritize negative information for survival, you internalize their indifference, criticism, or abandonment as evidence of your flaws. And this internalized story becomes a silent script that influences your confidence, your choices, and your emotional boundaries, long after the relationship or interaction has ended. What deepens the psychological injury is that the brain often confuses rejection with abandonment, activating old emotional wounds you may not even be aware of. Because when you were younger, your attachment patterns were shaped by how consistently you received love, attention, and safety. And if those experiences were unstable, inconsistent, or unpredictable, your brain became trained to equate emotional uncertainty with danger, meaning any form of rejection in adulthood reopens the same neurological pathways formed in childhood, making the pain feel older, heavier, and more intense than the situation alone would justify. And this is why some rejection feels manageable, while other rejection feels catastrophic. What makes rejection so powerful is that it activates the reward system of the brain in reverse. Because when you desire connection, your brain releases dopamine that motivates you to seek closeness. But when that closeness is denied, withdrawn, or lost, the reward system collapses, creating a dopamine crash that feels like emotional withdrawal, leaving you restless, anxious, and desperate for relief. And this withdrawal often tricks you into believing you need the person who rejected you in order to feel whole again, even if they were never healthy for you. Which is why rejection often creates obsession, not because you want them, but because your brain is trying to restore the dopamine balance that was shattered. What ultimately makes rejection one of the most painful psychological experiences is not the event itself, but the chain reaction it unleashes inside your mind. A chain reaction that distorts your perception, rewires your emotional patterns, disrupts your sense of identity, and alters your expectations for future relationships, all while convincing you that the pain you feel is a reflection of your worth rather than a reflection of your brain's outdated survival programming. And until you understand that the pain of rejection is a neurological illusion rather than a measure of your value, you will continue to interpret emotional discomfort as personal failure, instead of recognizing it as the brain's desperate attempt to protect you from something it does not understand. What you must understand now is that the brain doesn't simply react to rejection in the moment it happens, because long after the words fade and the situation ends, your mind continues replaying the event like a film stuck on loop. Not because you want to, but because your neural circuitry refuses to let go of what it perceives as unfinished danger. And this repetitive mental replay is the brain's attempt to analyze, predict, and prevent future pain, even though all it really does is trap you inside the memory of a wound that should have healed. What makes this loop so emotionally suffocating is that the brain treats rejection as a puzzle it must solve, constantly asking questions like, what did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? What could I have changed? And what do they have that I don't? And even when you don't consciously ask these questions, the emotional residue forces your mind to search for answers, digging into your insecurities, amplifying your past failures, and resurfacing old emotional injuries that you thought were forgotten, turning a single moment of rejection into a psychological excavation of every unresolved wound you've ever carried. What deepens this internal torment is the brain's tendency to assign meaning to everything, especially pain, because when something hurts you deeply, your mind refuses to believe it was random or insignificant. So it begins creating narratives to justify the experience. Narratives that usually blame you rather than the circumstances, causing you to interpret rejection as a reflection of your flaws rather than as a mismatch of situations, timing, or values. And this self-directed interpretation becomes the foundation for how you judge yourself in the future. What people never realize is that rejection warps your sense of emotional time, because the brain does not measure hurt in minutes or hours, but in intensity, which is why a 5-second message can haunt you for 5 months, why a single moment of humiliation can echo in your thoughts for years, and why someone's silence can feel louder than any words they could have spoken, because the mind does not let go of threats lightly. An emotional injury becomes a bookmarked memory that your brain keeps returning to, hoping it can learn enough to avoid experiencing that same pain again. What is even more dangerous is that the brain begins to label situations based on emotional similarity rather than logic. So if someone ignores your message today, your mind may react with the same intensity as a friend who abandoned you years ago, or a partner who betrayed you, or a parent who made you feel invisible, because the brain links emotional events by feeling rather than by fact, meaning that one new rejection can reopen an entire archive of old wounds as if they happened yesterday, creating emotional chaos that feels overwhelming and irrational, but is completely natural from a neurological standpoint. What complicates everything further is that the brain does not handle uncertainty well, and rejection is the ultimate form of uncertainty, because it contains no clear explanations, no predictable patterns, and no guaranteed resolution, which is why your mind keeps replaying every detail, searching for hints, clues, or signs that might explain what happened or what you missed. And the irony is that this endless analysis only intensifies the emotional damage, creating a psychological maze in which you chase answers that rarely exist, while the pain grows stronger simply because your brain refuses to accept ambiguity. What creates the deepest emotional scar is the way rejection attacks the illusion of control, because human beings survive by believing they have influence over their lives, their relationships, and their environment. And when someone rejects you, especially unexpectedly, that illusion shatters instantly, leaving you feeling powerless, confused, and destabilized. And this collapse of control is often more painful than the rejection itself, which is why people sometimes obsess, not over the person, but over the loss of control they represent. What adds another layer of cruelty is that the brain often misinterprets rejection as a collapse of social belonging, which triggers a primal fear older than language. Because to ancient humans, being excluded from the group meant death. So even mild or modern forms of rejection activate the same survival circuits that once protected your ancestors from isolation. And even though you live in a world with billions of people, your brain reacts as if one person's disapproval threatens your entire existence. Because biologically, rejection is tied to survival, not preference, which is why it feels so wrong, so heavy, and so catastrophic. What keeps you trapped in the psychological aftermath is that rejection erodes trust. Trust in others, trust in emotional stability, and worst of all, trust in yourself. Because when someone rejects you, your brain begins to doubt your own judgment, wondering whether you misread signs, misinterpreted intentions, or miscalculated emotional risks. And this erosion of self-trust makes future connections harder, because you begin to question not only other people's motives, but your ability to navigate relationships in the first place, which often leads you to either pull away from intimacy altogether or cling too tightly in fear of losing it again. What's even more unsettling is that the brain can become addicted to the emotional pattern created by rejection, because the cycle of desire, hope, confusion, and pain releases a mixture of dopamine, cortisol, and adrenaline that creates an unstable but powerful emotional loop. And this loop can make you obsess over the person who rejected you, not because they are special or irreplaceable, but because your brain is caught in the pattern of seeking resolution, closure, or validation from the very source of the wound, which is why people chase the person who hurt them, check their messages compulsively, or cling to memories that should have been released. What ultimately makes the experience of rejection psychologically transformative, sometimes in destructive ways, is that it forces you to confront the parts of yourself you avoid, the fears you suppress, the insecurities you hide, and the needs you deny, because rejection exposes the truth you don't want to admit, that beneath the surface of your confidence, you still carry unresolved emotional wounds, unmet childhood needs, unhealed attachment patterns, and unspoken fears of unworthiness. And instead of recognizing rejection as an external event, your brain makes it internal, turning it into evidence of everything you secretly doubt about yourself. What you must now realize is that rejection is not simply an emotional event, but a psychological turning point, a moment that can either imprison you in cycles of insecurity and self-doubt, or awaken you to the hidden patterns that control your behavior. Because while rejection can wound you deeply, it also reveals the exact places where your healing needs to happen, the exact fears that hold you back, and the exact emotional vulnerabilities that shape your relationships. And until you understand that the pain of rejection is a mirror reflecting your inner world, not a verdict on your worth, you will continue believing the illusion your brain creates instead of recognizing the deeper truth beneath it. What you must understand now is that the final and most disturbing reaction the brain has to rejection is the way it reshapes your future without your permission. Because while you think you move on, while you believe you've healed, while you convince yourself the pain has faded, your mind quietly rewires itself based on what hurt you before, creating new patterns of caution, new rules of emotional engagement, new fears disguised as logic, and new limits that were born not from wisdom, but from wounds you never fully processed. What makes this so dangerous is that the brain believes it is protecting you by restricting you, and this protection often looks like self-sabotage, because instead of allowing you to take emotional risks that could bring connection, intimacy, or love, the brain begins filtering your experiences through a survival lens, making you hold back when you should open up, pull away when you should lean in, question sincerity when you should accept kindness, and reject opportunities that could bring happiness simply because they resemble moments that once caused you pain. What people fail to see is that the brain is more loyal to fear than it is to growth, because fear keeps you alive, and growth only becomes useful if you survive long enough to experience it, meaning your mind will always choose safety over vulnerability, even if that safety isolates you, limits you, or destroys relationships that could have healed you. And this is why your brain often convinces you that withdrawing is strength, that emotional numbness is maturity, that indifference is power, when in reality, these are simply the survival instincts of a mind that has been hurt too many times and no longer trusts your ability to endure another emotional blow. What's most heartbreaking is that rejection can make you distrust the very things you once craved. Because when your brain begins associating emotional closeness with future pain, connection becomes threatening, affection becomes suspicious, and love becomes a high-risk gamble, pushing you into patterns where you distance yourself from people who genuinely care and gravitate toward those who offer emotional inconsistency. Because inconsistency feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe even when it hurts you, proving that the brain prefers predictable pain over unpredictable kindness. What deepens this internal conflict is that the brain stores emotional memories in both the mind and the body, meaning rejection doesn't only live in your thoughts, but in your physical responses, your tension, your silence, your avoidance, your hesitation. Because when someone gets too close, your body flinches, your chest tightens, your breathing shifts, your muscles brace, and without realizing it, you communicate fear, even when your words say you're fine. And these subconscious signals often create misunderstandings that reinforce your belief that intimacy is dangerous. even though the danger exists only in the echo of past wounds. What keeps you locked in these patterns is the way rejection influences your internal dialogue, turning your inner voice into an emotional detective who is always searching for signs of danger, signs of abandonment, signs of betrayal, signs of fading interest, signs of emotional distance. And this hyper-awareness, this constant scanning, makes you overthink silence, tone, timing, pauses, delays, and even the smallest fluctuations in someone's behavior, creating emotional storms that often lead to conflict and confusion, which then become proof to your brain that closeness is unsafe, continuing a cycle you never intentionally created. What creates the deepest, most invisible wound is the way rejection shapes your expectations of yourself. Because once you experience enough emotional pain, your brain begins to downgrade your identity without your awareness, convincing you that you are difficult to love, easy to leave, replaceable, undeserving, or fundamentally flawed. And these beliefs seep into how you communicate, how you set boundaries, how you pursue goals, how you express needs, and even how you dream, turning your mind into a prison built out of assumptions you never questioned, because the pain felt too real to examine. What people rarely understand is that the brain is not trying to destroy you when it reacts this way. It is trying to prevent you from dying emotionally in the same way it protects you from dying physically. Because ancient humans who ignored rejection, who ignored signs of social exclusion, did not survive long enough to pass on their genes, meaning the brain evolved to be hypersensitive to any threat to belonging, approval, or connection. So even in the modern world, where relationships are optional and individuality is encouraged, your mind still responds to rejection as if you've been cast out into the wilderness alone. What becomes truly transformative is the moment you realize that the brain's instinctive response to rejection is not the truth, but a biological reflex, because the pain you feel is the evolutionary residue of fears that once kept your ancestors alive, not a reflection of your worth, not evidence that you are unlovable, unwanted, or inferior, and certainly not an accurate measure of how others see you, meaning the emotional agony that feels so personal is in fact deeply impersonal, powered by systems inside your mind that react automatically, primitively, and without your conscious consent. What gives you power is understanding that awareness breaks the cycle. Because once you recognize that rejection activates neural pathways rather than defining who you are, you begin to separate the moment from the meaning, the event from the identity, the pain from the story you've attached to it. And in that separation, you reclaim the ability to respond consciously instead of through fear, allowing you to build relationships without the shadow of old wounds dictating your reactions. What ultimately matters most is accepting that while the brain is wired to protect you from rejection, you are not obligated to live inside the limits it creates, because healing does not come from avoiding the pain, but from understanding it, reframing it, and refusing to let it shape your worldview, your relationships, or your belief in your own value. And once you learn to see rejection as a moment rather than a measurement, a signal rather than a sentence, you begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that fear once silenced, allowing you to pursue connection with courage instead of caution. What you must leave with is the truth that rejection will always hurt. It is built into the architecture of the human mind. But that hurt does not have to define you, control you, or guide your future. Because once you understand the psychological machinery behind the pain, rejection becomes less of an emotional collapse and more of a human experience, one that you can navigate with clarity, strength, and resilience. Because the moment you stop believing the lies your brain tells you in fear, you stop being controlled by the pain that once felt inescapable. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.